Did you? We saw we did that.
Yeah. Go to the first slide. I think you're on, which slide are you on? Go back one slide? Yeah, the first one, thank you. Okay. I hope you can read the text. Yes, you can, okay. I'm being somewhat arrogant in the title I've given there, because rather than saying an alternative to neoliberalism, I'm saying the alternative to neoliberalism. I want to explain why. And pardon me, just getting my own screen up to speed here. Thank you. Okay. If we look at where the crisis came from, the crisis wasn't anticipated by the mainstream, because what they saw was a period of declining cycles in inflation and unemployment until the crisis hit, and then without warning, this huge explosion in unemployment and inflation turned to deflation. So what they were seeing, just to go back, if I can go back, let's see, was that period of decline. They thought they knew what was happening. They were getting it together. And then without warning, the surprise explosion occurred and they had no idea. And they're now managing, or trying to manage, the aftermath of that with the same theories that didn't see the crisis coming in the first place. So what I'm going to look at here is the factor they ignore, because this is the same data now. I'm now going to include private debt as well. And you can tell the theme between the three speakers here, the importance of private debt and the fact that it's left out from the mainstream. So now you can see that while there were declining cycles in employment and inflation, there was a rising level of private debt up to and through the crisis, and then on the other side, a plunge in private debt. And a huge part of the increase in public debt has come out of counteracting the impact of falling private debt. Now, I'm going to explain the logic after I show some of the data first. But my argument is the entire OECD has let itself turn into the same situation the Japanese found themselves in 18 years earlier. The Japan's crisis began in 1990. This is a chart of private debt to GDP ratios around the world. And you can see the first part is Japan, whose peak level of private debt occurred about 5 years after its crisis at about 225% of GDP. Then it's declined, and since about 2005 it's been bouncing around at about 170%. Look at all the other nations there. You can see the same trend up to we call the global financial crisis. Rising private debt, peaking after the crisis, various lengths of time, and then declining. Now notice down the bottom here I've got Greece. Now Greece has got a lower level of private debt than most of the other countries, but you can see it rises, same sort of way, reaches a peak after the crisis and then flatlines as a percentage of GDP. It's actually falling, of course, because Greek GDP is also falling. So that's the impact of private debt, which of course is ignored by the whole neoliberal agenda. Nobody talks about private debt when they're neoliberal. Okay? They leave it out. They don't quite know why, but they leave it out. Now I want to show the impact of those changes in private debt. Put the empirical data in front of you first of all. Because again, the mainstream ignores this completely. I think you have to make it the topic if we're going to turn this around and take over from the neoliberals. Because when you take a look at the change in private debt and correlate that to the level of unemployment, you can see that increasing private debt means falling unemployment and vice versa. The correlation there between the change in private debt and the level of unemployment is minus 0.91. You can't get a much higher correlation than that. And notice that Japan's crisis, which what I'm showing you here now, Japan's crisis began in roughly in 1990 when the rate of growth of private debt fell. And then since about 1998, there have been in periods of deleveraging where the private sector debt is falling, most of the time small amounts of rising debt, then falling, but mainly going through falling private debt rather than the phenomenon before the crisis of private debt rising much faster than GDP. Now the United States fell into the same trap. This again is the same data for America. I'm looking here at the change in private debt and the level of unemployment in America. Exactly the same pattern. Rising private debt before the crisis. Unemployment goes up and down in direct opposite relationship to the change in private debt. The correlation there between the change in the level of private debt and the level of unemployment is minus 0.93. Now, the mainstream economists will tell you don't need to worry about private debt. That's like saying you don't need to worry about the main thing that determines the level of the economy, which is nonsense, but that's what they're doing. Now, when you say, what are we faced for the next 2 decades? And if the left can't win the political debate in the next 2 decades, it's never going to win. Okay? What you can see we're going to face is, again, what Japan faced in the years after its crisis finished. So what I'm doing in this chart is I've taken the Japanese data and I've moved it forward and said, if we end up doing the same thing in the rest of the OECD that Japan did, which is ignore its level of private debt, we're going to have the same impact on the economy of the dynamics of private debt in Japan. And what that shows you is a peaking level of private debt, then falling, and then bouncing around at about the level that private debt is now, 175% of GDP. Far too high. What it means is you don't get any sustained boost from demand coming from credit anymore, and you have a very low level of growth of the economy. Waiting for the charts to catch up there. Now, the reason we have such a huge crisis now, why this is such an important time in the history of capitalism, is this is the biggest crisis, the biggest debt crisis in the history of capitalism. It isn't something which is just a sporadic thing which is going to go away. Okay? Because when you look at the level of private debt in America going back, as I do on this chart, to 1834, I've normalised the data so you can compare data from different time periods. What you can see is the level of private debt in America now exceeds the peak of the Great Depression. And of course the major deleveraging in America was done not during the Great Depression, but during the Second World War, when an enormous increase in government debt financed the war against the Nazis. And that then gave the cash flow to private corporations to let them pay their debts down. So America began the post-war period at a level of debt of about 40% of GDP, quite low. But then it's risen from 40% to 170% of GDP. And now we're back in the same effective situation as the Great Depression, with the balancing impact of a much larger government sector then than they had back in the 1920s and 30s. You can see the percentage of government debt in the 1930s and before the Second World War began. If you look at 1940 on that chart, the level of government debt never exceeded 20% of GDP. Now we're talking about a level of government debt of 90% of GDP. Now that's balanced the impact of the downturn far more effectively than occurred during the Great Depression, but it will not revive the economy. It'll remain in that stultified situation so long as the level of private debt is ignored. Now, non-orthodox economists like myself, Michael Hudson, and the late Wynne Godley have been focusing upon private debt. If you heard the three of us talking this morning, it's all about the importance of private debt. And this is the level when Wynne Godley began to warn about a certain crisis. This is when I began to warn about it. They were still being ignored. And the left politically hasn't adopted our arguments yet. But I think we've got the only arguments you can use that can give you an effective alternative to being the nice version of neoliberalism, which is what the left has turned out to be, rather than the nasty version, which is what the Tories and the Conservatives do in general. So this all comes in, from my thinking, from the work of Hyman Minsky and what he called the financial instability hypothesis. And looking at Minsky, he summarised his views on capitalism this way. He said capitalism is inherently flawed, being prone to booms, crises and depressions. And he said this instability is due to characteristics capitalism, the financial system must possess if it's to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. In other words, it's not something you can reform out of the way. You cannot reform away the problems Minsky sees, and I'm going to prove that to you shortly. He said such a financial system will be capable of both generating signals that induce an accelerating desire to invest and of financing that accelerating investment. We called his model the financial instability hypothesis, and the combination of cyclical behaviour in the economy, private debt, and non-equilibrium behaviour at the absolute centre of the way that he thought. And this is, again, a beautiful summary of his views, is that the natural starting place for analysing the relation between debt and income, and notice that he's saying there is a relationship between debt, private debt, and income. Now, again, that's a heresy against neoliberals. It's even something that we've had a hard time convincing our fellow post-Keynesians of, that actually is a relationship there. And I finally produced an emphatic proof of that, which I'll talk about later, but published in October of this year. So the natural starting point, according to Minsky, for analysing the relation between debt and income is to take an economy with a cyclical past that is now doing well. So in that situation, the debt that this economy has reflects a period where it did not do so well. So there's been a previous debt crisis. In the aftermath of that debt crisis, the level of debt that banks and borrowers will accept is conservative compared to the previous situation. But as the economy recovers, it becomes evident that existing debts are easily validated and units that were heavily in debt prospered. It pays to lever. That becomes the vision. So after the event, there's too high a margin for safety. So what do? You borrow more money. Acceptable debt structures change in the deal-making that goes on between banks, investment bankers and businessmen. The acceptable amount of debt to use in financing various types of activities and positions increases. And consequently, what you get is an increase in debt that drives up asset prices and pushes the economy into a boom. So a period of tranquil growth leads to speculative excess. And he says, therefore, stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which investment is financed in the capitalist economy. So, and this is an incredibly strong insight. It's very opposite to what you would get out of Bran and Sweezy style approach to interpreting capitalism, and also the labour theory of value. I agree with Michael about the importance of isolating rent-seeking there, but a huge part of the left has been paralysed with this nonsense empirical concept of the labour theory of value, which leads to the idea of a declining rate of profit and a tendency for stagnation in capitalism. Now, Minsky says the fundamental instability of a capitalist economy is upward. The tendency to transform doing well into a speculative investment boom is the basic instability in a capitalist economy. And I think that's the deep insight into the nature of capitalism. Now, I'm going to show you a very complicated system dynamics model in a moment, just a slide. If I had control of the mouse here, I would be able to simulate it and show it to you. But it looks extremely complicated, but it boils down to three irrefutably true statements. And this is why I want to emphasise that this is the alternative to neoliberalism, because you can only disagree with these statements if you're also willing to disagree with gravity. Okay? Criticising these is like saying gravity, I deny gravity. Okay, well, the first one of them is to say that the employment rate will rise if the rate of economic growth exceeds the sum of population change and change in labour productivity. That's simply a fact. If the economy grows faster than the sum of population growth and labour productivity growth, then the rate of employment will rise. That's simply a definition. The second part is to say the wages share of output will rise if money wage demands exceed the sum of inflation and growth in labour productivity. That's also a fact. If workers demand a money wage rate that exceeds the sum of inflation and the change in labour productivity, workers' share of output goes up. Okay. Now, those are two facts which in themselves generate a cyclical world, cyclical vision of capitalism, but even conventional economists can't disagree with those two. What they leave out is this third one. The ratio of private debt to GDP will rise if the rate of growth of private debt exceeds the sum of inflation plus the rate of real economic growth. That's also a fact, but they ignore that fact. That's the one the three speakers here are all taking into account. So there's an essential role for private debt here when you include that. Now, those, as I said, are simply facts. You cannot say what type of economic behaviour you're going to get out of those by simply looking at them. I couldn't say that either. I would not know what the model coming out of those three statements would do unless I simulated it. But what you get is a complex interaction between the three. And what you find is that it captures the history of the neoliberal period we've been through. Now, this is what the model looks like. Okay? If I had a bit of time, I'd take you through that, and I could actually explain it to you all, and I could simulate it live and show you what's going on. But just to show you very quickly here, notice what happens with inflation. A period of booms and ups and downs in inflation, which is the second chart there. Actually, that's too complicated to talk to, so I'll show you the way of putting it all together using the three major axes that I speak about, which is inflation, unemployment, and the ratio of private debt to GDP. The chart on the left-hand side is the actual data for inflation and unemployment in America. And what you see is a period where there's a stagflation period where the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment both rise, and then you have a series of cycles that seem to be pushing back and towards a low level of unemployment and a low level of inflation, which is when Bernanke and all the neoliberal economists were triumphant and thought they'd solved the economic problem, and then without warning it blasts out sideways. High in unemployment and deflation. Now on the right hand side, that's me showing my model of Minsky. I get exactly the same basic behaviour. A boom out to stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation, and then it seems to be cycling back into equilibrium, and then also apparently without warning, off you go into high unemployment and inflation. In fact, what I'm showing you there is only two dimensions of a system. And if I tilt up both those systems, I'm trying to do that now, let's see what's happening here. Great, that animation's not working. Okay, I'll try again. No, it's not going to work. What a pity. Okay, when I tilt those up, the colour change is a rising level of private. Can you click on those two? Just click on them. That one and click on the other one. Yep, click and click. Oh, great. Go back again. Let's try again. Fabulous. Not going to work. Damn. I'm doing it on my screen. I can't do it on yours. When I tilt it up and the people on the front desk can see this, what you have is a three-dimensional picture with a rising level of private debt. And the collapse occurs because of the increase in private debt. So I'll have to give that a miss, I'm afraid. And maybe I'll show it to you, and if you want to see it, I can show you later. But that model, it's actually derived from a verbal model of a trade cycle in Chapter 25 of Volume 1 of Capital. And intriguingly, Marx concluded with this statement. He said, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is or the rate of profit, obviously, is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages is the dependent, not the independent variable. Now, much to my amazement, he was right. What he guessed verbally 1.5 centuries ago is correct, because wages end up being the residual when you include debt in the economy. Capitalists have a share that fluctuates around an equilibrium level, and what's happening there is there's a rising amount of money going to bankers, offset by a falling amount going to workers. But at some point you get the maximum rate at which you can push workers' wages down, and at that point deflation follows as well, and deflation plus debt compounding means that the falling workers' share no longer offsets the rising bankers' share, and profit collapses. And collapses apparently without warning, unless you have this system view of the way the economy operates, and the economy then falls into a debt crisis. And that's exactly what we've done. So I now graph the dynamics in my own model. The black line is the workers' share of output. And you can see that big increase, which is like happened back in the 1970s, and then a series of cycles as workers' share falls. You can see the red line, which is the level of banker income, which rises over time and gets exponential towards the end. The blue line is capitalist share. Now, from a capitalist point of view, that's heading towards equilibrium. Set of cycles, diminishing cycles, and then suddenly, 35 years into the simulation, it collapses and goes totally negative. The reason is that the rate of decline of workers' share has reached its maximum level, can't go any faster. You've still got compounding. Inflation has fallen, so inflation is no longer reducing the real debt burden. And then bang, compounding of debt means debt takes over the economy collapses. And that's the situation we're in now. Now, the only bulkhead about that, against that, is government spending, which of course the euro guarantees you can't do. So I see the main class struggle in capitalism as not workers versus capitalists, but workers versus finance. And the tragedy is that finance is winning under neoliberalism. But of course it leads to a crisis. And we need to say it's directly what's happened and to take that battle on, as Michael said earlier, to abolish private debts and to use the capacity of the state to do it. Now, again, we can find this in Marx. This is a wonderful set of statements from, I think, from Volume 3 of Capital, saying, talk about centralisation. The credit system, which has its focus in the so-called national banks and the big money lenders and usurers surrounding them, constitutes enormous centralisation. And that's, again, been Michael's point about the central planning. This is, it's ironic, but this is what's been going on. And gives this class of parasites the fabulous power not only to periodically despoil industrial capitalists, but also to interfere in actual production in a most dangerous manner. And this gang knows nothing about production and has nothing to do with it. So we're not leaving our roots, we're going back to the sound foundations of them to take this perspective on. Now, what I want to conclude with is the importance of thinking in a monetary way and making the case you need to make about monetarism, of neoliberalism. And I might take about 5 minutes to do that, if that's all right. Okay. And I know that it's so hard to communicate to the public as to why the government should run a deficit. People think the government should run a surplus. Okay? It's not just our neoliberal opponents who believe that, it's also the public. So I found this a very effective way to convince people in what happens when you run a surplus. And that's say, draw a rectangle in your head. Draw a rectangle and divide it in half and call one half the government and the other half the private sector. If the government's going to run a surplus, then there has to be a flow of money from the private sector to the government, which means the taxes the government's imposing upon the people have to exceed the spending the government does upon the people. Okay? So there's a net flow of money from the private sector to the government if the government's going to run a surplus. Now that, again, is already something people don't think. They think if the government runs a surplus and saves money, I can save money too. No, in a monetary system, if the government's going to run a surplus, it has to take money out of people's private bank accounts. Therefore, let's call this flow net gov. The government surplus means a private sector deficit. And I know modern monetary theory has made this case many times, but I think I found a more effective way of communicating it. So you have a private sector which is necessarily going to be in deficit if the government sector is in surplus. And you can show this flow, which I'm calling net gov, from one to the other. So the Troika has a target of forcing Greece to run a 4.5% primary surplus, meaning that every year an amount of money equivalent to 4.5% of GDP has to be taken out of private bank accounts and given to the government, where effectively it ends up being cancelled. Now, where does the private sector get that money? Now, on a one-off basis, you can do it by running your bank balance down a bit, not a problem so much, but it's the opposite of what people who propose a surplus think actually happens. They think a surplus means the private sector can save more too. But if the private sector is going to do this on a sustained basis, which is what Greece is being asked to do, then either the public has to run its bank balances down to zero, or it has to borrow the money it needs from the private sector banks. So you've got to take that rectangle and divide the private sector in two again, and call half of it the private banking system and the other half the non-bank system. And for the private households and businesses to make that transfer across to the government, courtesy of taxes, the private banks have to run a deficit, by which I mean their loans have to exceed repayments. That's a normal thing in a capitalist economy. Okay? Loans tend to grow over time. But let's say you're borrowing the money from the banks to pay what the government wants you to pay, so the private sector bank balances remain constant. Then the amount of money the private sector is going to borrow from the banks will also be net gov. Net gov will be equal to net bank, as I'm showing it there. So the government running a surplus means the private sector has to borrow money from the private banks to keep on doing it. And if they did that, the amount of money in the private economy would remain constant. Now, how can the economy grow if it has a constant amount of money? Well, the only way that can happen is if the velocity of money rises over time. But empirically, we know that's not the case. Not only has it been falling for the last 40 years, this is the data in America, where the velocity of money rose until the 1980s and has been falling ever since. It is now down, hitting pretty close to money only turning over once a year, as it's defined here. That's not going to work. In fact, velocity falls during the crisis as well. So the increasing velocity of money is not going to help us. So if the government's going to run a surplus, while the private sector is borrowing the money from the banks to pay the surplus that the government wants, at best you're going to get no economic growth, but you're going to get a rising ratio of private debt to GDP, which means at some point you're going to get a crisis. So to actually keep on growing, which is what the private sector is trying to do and what the neoliberals expect, what you have to have is the borrowing from the banks has to exceed the surplus the government wants. And then you can get growth out of the economy, but that requires an even faster rate of growth in the ratio of private debt to GDP. So the medium-term consequences of achieving private sector growth while also running a government surplus is the financial crisis. That's where this program is leading, if you could get growth at the same time. Now, of course, what you actually get is deleveraging by the private sector. And again, we're all told about the dangers of public debt in Greece. Nobody's talking about private debt in Greece except for the speakers on this podium. But here's the ratio of private debt to GDP and the unemployment rate in Greece. Now, to make the correlation more obvious, because it's all downwards, I've turned the unemployment rate upside down on the right-hand side of the chart. And I started at the top of the chart is 5% unemployment, the bottom is 30%. And you can see the correlation there. What's actually driving the crisis is deleveraging by the private sector. And because the government isn't spending a surplus in to counter it, that deleveraging is continuing, whereas it stopped in America. Now, the crisis isn't over in America. It'll happen again because we've got such a high level of debt. But at least the government has attenuated the severity of the downturn, whereas the Troika's policies have amplified the severity of the downturn and made this as bad as if you didn't have a government sector at all, which is what my model showed you beforehand, and that leads you into a black hole of debt. So the only sustainable situation is the opposite of what the Troika is pushing on you. First of all, you have a surplus, taking money out of the economy. Secondly, you have deleveraging by the private sector, also taking money out of the economy. The only thing adding money, after all the decline in workers' wages, is exports being greater than imports now because of the collapse of imports, which is giving a bit of money back into the economy. But overall, that's forcing contraction upon the Greek economy, the opposite of what the Troika, I think, actually naively believes will happen because of the crisis. So the only situation that's sustainable in the long term is this one, where you have the governments normally running a deficit. My analogy there is to tell people that governments are not like households. Government are like banks. They can create money and so can banks. And if they do their money creation role by running a deficit, the private sector doesn't have to become as indebted to the private banks. We should be aiming for global trade balance, which is what Keynes tried to achieve with Bancor, because otherwise you get the effects Michael talked about earlier, where you outsource your money production to another country, then you can get growth coming out of that. But this is the alternative way of talking about the economy that I think will give the left a chance to take on the neoliberals. Thank you.